All right, we'll go ahead and this is the last lesson in this series of Ezra and Nehemiah. So I'll try to get through, and at the end there's some summary information which I think you'll find. Some of it may be new to you, some of it may not be new to you, but I'll try to do some summarizing of some of this. Just to put everybody back in a general sense. Remember that the book that was included originally in the writings, they suspect that Nehemiah was the writer of both, of what is in your scripture as Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra is not accredited with writing any of this, all right? And of course, Nehemiah, if he did, he probably used a present-day historian, a chronicler, to actually pen the things that had happened as he related them to him, to try to get them down on paper. Most of the Old Testament stories are that way, to where there was someone who actually did the writing, but there would be that person who's relating the events and trying to put those in perspective. Now, what we want to do today is try to wind. Last week we had one chapter where the people all stood in place and confessed their sins. They had been called to task for what they had done, and so they confessed to God everything their ancestors had done, and how many times God had been called upon to bring them back, punish them, but to always bring them back. And I try to relate that to you in the sense that it kind of explains the terminology later on in the New Testament when it says, when in general it says God is patient with His creation because He doesn't want anybody to be lost. People are asking that same question. Why haven't you already ended this thing and taken us up? We're tired of waiting. And the answer is that God is patient, because if God wasn't patient, a lot of us would have been in trouble, right? At some point in time in history, if He had decided enough is enough, I'm not going to wait any longer. So that's what we talked about, to define that New Testament verse about God being patient, not wanting anyone to be lost. Now it's one thing to sign a covenant. As all of us sitting here know, it's one thing to make an agreement with God and having that moment where you say, I've done this and I've done this. Let's start over. And that's what the people were doing. They said, let's start over. We're going to renew the covenant that you made with Moses. And so they did that. And they all signed. They got their leaders and the Levites and the priests and all the family heads to sign on to this thing. Sounds good, doesn't it? Nehemiah goes back. He remembered Artaxerxes had allowed him to go, but he said, and at some point in time, you come back and do a report for me. Tell me how things are going. Artaxerxes made him the governor of Jerusalem, or of Judea, you might say. But his primary purpose is to rebuild the city and reinstall the law. Ezra has come in there and done his part, but somebody now has to enforce the covenant. The people have made the covenant with God and signed off, but now somebody has to make sure that it gets done. It's easy to make the agreement. It's more difficult to implement it among all the people. Now, the law that is mentioned in Nehemiah 13, the last chapter. So if you're looking at the last chapter, Nehemiah chapter 13, there is a law mentioned. If you have your thumb put there, the law that it says somewhere in the law, and when they were reading the law, this question came up, and it's referring to Deuteronomy 23, verses 3 through 6. So in this agreement, and as he's reading this law, it's referring back to a statement that's made in Deuteronomy. And in that, it can be translated as mixed multitudes in its original application. When they're fixing to come in, God tells them in Deuteronomy, certain people are not allowed into the assembly. Now, the word assembly there is referring to the nation of Israel. As they come out and are fixing to go into Israel, he's referring to them as the assembly. We find out that when that group of people received the law at the foot of Mount Sinai, the New Testament says, when the church met with God at the foot of Mount Sinai and received the law. That's one translation. Later on, that translation is changed to read, when the congregation. Now, we use these same terms today, don't we? They originate all the way back. Whether you're talking about a congregation, a church, an assembly, it's all coming from the same root words, okay? And so today, the congregation meets. We have chosen over a period of years to apply the word church very specifically to this one. But as far as God was talking, anytime Israel come together for a purpose as an assembly, certain people are not allowed into the assembly. Now, Nehemiah 13, the original writing in Deuteronomy says all foreigners. In its original application in Deuteronomy, it applies to the tribes of the Ammonites and the Moabites. And the reason was, when they were fixing to go in, Moses and Joshua had asked them to help. Could you furnish us with water and food? And they said, no, we're not helping you come in at all. And so God has basically assigned a penalty to the Moabites and the Ammonites and says they are never, ever allowed in the assembly. Now, in Deuteronomy, there is a section that we're talking about that's called mixed laws. And in that it goes into certain people are allowed in, certain people are never allowed in. It talks about some groups are not allowed in even until the 10th generation afterwards. Some are never allowed in. He does separate some of these outside people. For example, it says the Edomites may be allowed into the assembly because they're your kin. Now, how does he get that? How does he get the idea that the Edomites are related to the Israelites? You remember the other son, Esau? He's the founder, the father, the originator of the Edomites. So he says they're kin. So they could be, if they were purified, be allowed into the assembly. So there's exceptions made to the rule. okay? And those are all spelled out in Deuteronomy as to which ones are allowed in and which ones are never allowed in. Now, it says, on that day the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people, and there it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God, because they had not met the Israelites with food or water, but had hired Balaam to call a curse down on them. When the people heard this law, they excluded from Israel all who were of foreign descent. Now, that law, that statement was made specifically about the Moabites and Ammonites. This is a language issue. When it says they excluded everybody, all Ammonites and all Moabites were excluded. Now, in subsequent readings at festivals, it could have applied more than once, since God consistently through time said, don't have anything to do with these people that are in the country, because if you do, it's going to cause you problems. It's going to cause a problem between me and you later on. They will be the responsible for it. In verses 6 and 7, it appears that the application occurs almost immediately when Nehemiah returns from Susa. So the covenant's been signed. Now Nehemiah, the walls have been built, the temple's operating, the altar's operating. He says, it's time for me to go back to Artaxerxes and give my report. So he leaves. He comes back from Susa, which is, at that time, that is the capital, the operating capital. There were many capitals that the Persians used, several different capitals. Susa is the one that is being used right now. It's also the city for Esther. When you think about the story of Esther and that thing, Susa is the capital that is being talked about. So Nehemiah comes back. Wow. One of the enemies, the high priest, has allowed Tobiah. Remember last week and the weeks before, this Tobiah the Ammonite has caused all this trouble with them, trying to build the walls and everything and try to reinstate the city. And all of a sudden, the high priest has cleaned out. Remember, Tobiah and Sanballat had opposed Nehemiah when he first come. They've cleaned out a room in the temple ground and let him move in. The exact relationship between Tobiah and the high priest, Elizabeth, is not explained. It does not explain how this happened. But the situation is when Nehemiah comes back and he finds Tobiah living in the temple grounds. That's where all the grain offerings, the frankincense, utensils, tithe of grain, wine, and oil, that's where all that is kept. And they've cleaned that out and just set it out and give him a room. When Nehemiah returns, he threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room. First thing he does, he doesn't even wait to unpack. As soon as he finds out that this has taken place, he takes all of his stuff and throws it out. He's cleansing the temple ground. In verses 7 and 8, Nehemiah commanded that the chamber had to be purified, and following the cleansing, the items belonging to the temple were returned into the chamber. Now, my observation on that, every time that Nehemiah finds a problem where the people have went back on their word, his actions are immediate. He doesn't wait. He doesn't hold a committee. He doesn't try to smooth things over. If they're in violation of the law, his actions are immediate and they're guided by the commandments. Remember that he had the authority to do it. He had been appointed by Artaxerxes as the governor of Judea. So he had the legal authority to do those things. And the law of the land, it was very specific. When Artaxerxes allowed him to go back, he said, you are to establish the law of Moses as the law of the land. So that law is preeminent. Whatever it says works. You would think that the people remember, we're guilty. We honestly apply to you, God, we're guilty. We're not going to do it anymore. We're going to reform our ways. We're going to go back and obey the rules. Well, when he comes back, he not only finds Tobiah in the temple ground, but he discovers the people had not been giving their tithes for the priests and Levites. And verse 10 says they all went back home. They had a place to stay. The tithing, the original tithe, was to support the priests and Levites. They were not allowed to work when it was their time to serve as a temple servant. They would leave their villages and come and live in the temple area. There was housing there for them. So they were not allowed to make a living, so it was the people's obligation to feed them. Even in their villages back home, the village that was set aside for the Levites, the tithe money was used to buy grain, olive, the basic ingredients of life, so that they did not have to work, so they could always serve. That's what tithing was about. Sometimes the word tithing comes up today. You hear people have conversations about tithing and why don't we tithe anymore? That was the purpose of tithing, was to support the Levites. So Nehemiah brought them back to the temple and told the people to return to giving their tithes. He restores a group to oversee the tithing. That means that he assigns the people who were responsible for putting check marks. When it was time for you to bring your tithe, your name got crossed off. Okay, he returned his tithe. Everybody was obligated to tithe to support the Levites and the priests. Nehemiah is a humble guy, but he's constantly in prayer. And he just says, God, remember me for the things that I did for you. So what's going on in his mind? He says, God, please remember how faithfully I kept your rules and how I served you. So that kind of tells me something about the character and the motivations of Nehemiah. Now, we think that's one problem. What's one of the biggest rules in the commandments about the Sabbath? What goes on the Sabbath under the rules of Moses? I'm sorry, what? You don't work. You don't work. Now, what exam are there allowances? Yeah. If you someday when you have some time, go back there and read the allowances that are allowed In other words, if you're in a village and you come upon your ox in a ditch, you can get him out. Fact is, if you're a neighbor and you come on you can help him. You can do that. You're not working for a profit. You're not gaining something for yourself. So there are exceptions. By the time that got to the New Testament, the book was about this thick. What you could do on the Sabbath, what you couldn't do on the Sabbath. You know, if you were late to synagogue in Nazareth, you could run to the Sabbath. But when the Sabbath was over, or when the synagogue service was over, you couldn't run home. You could walk, but you couldn't run. Remember the story of Jesus walking and his disciples, his close disciples were hungry, and they went through a field and they stripped off the grain and was eating the grain, and they come under very severe, you were threshing grain because they'd reached down there and pulled kernels of grain and ate the grain. The rule went that specific. You can't pull off the wheat kernels and eat the kernel because that's threshing the grain. So those rules all went into arguments and debates as to what was allowed, what wasn't allowed, and all those things, okay? So they took something that was very good, that was meant to honor God, one day a week, stop, rest, take care of things that relate to me. Better go back here. Nehemiah warns the people and the noble and warns the wrath of God on Israel if they continue to profane the Sabbath. He commands the gates of Jerusalem to be shut and not reopened until after the Sabbath. He found merchants camping outside the gates, so the people would go outside. They would go outside the city gates, and they thought, well, we're obeying the rule. We're not in Jerusalem. We are now outside, and we can buy stuff out there. Now, what it was, remember that the people living in Jerusalem were primarily Israelites. There were others. At the beginning of this section, it says that even some of the Israelites opened their stands and was selling food and stuff and wares inside. He said no. He said you can't do that anymore. So he stopped them. But then he found the foreign merchants were coming, and when he kicked them out on the Sabbath and closed the gates and said you can't go out and buy from them, so they just set up booths outside, and people were going outside. Well, then now he just says you got to leave altogether. So he run them out. Nobody was allowed to open their booth up just outside the gate. Uh-oh, here we are again. Didn't we just handle that not too many years ago? When Ezra found out after he had come back, he found all the mixed marriages and everything like that, and the problems they were causing. Send them back. Send the wives and the children back. Okay. Several years later, Nehemiah comes back. That some of the Jews had married women from foreign nations, Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Now, anybody know where Ashdod is? It's having its own problems again today, isn't it? Ashdod is in Gaza. As you approach Jerusalem, go up the hill from the Dead Sea, and you get closer and closer. I always remember this because I was sitting on the bus and about half awake and half asleep. And then there was a road sign, Ashdod, 35 kilometers. And all of a sudden I said, where did I hear the word Ashdod? And I immediately went to Scripture and found out where I found out about Ashdod. It's one of the cities that's being talked about here, clean back at this time. It's that old a city. He said half of the children only speak their own language. So there's one thing right off the bat. There's not any Hebrew lessons going on in these families. And they did not know how to speak the language of Judah. Now, same thing. You remember what Ezra did when he found out about all this mixed measure back and forth? He just sat down in a heap and tore his robe and threw dust on his head. He could not believe that the people would be that disobedient so quick. Nehemiah became enraged toward those who disobeyed the rules. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, you are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves. Was it not because of marriages like these that Solomon, king of Israel, sinned? Even he was led into sin by foreign women. We all remember the stories, don't we? He had hundreds of wives from all different nations, political marriages basically. Now the big one. Remember, we started the lessons back 7 lessons ago. We started the lessons back telling about the Samaritan woman story. Now we're getting close to understanding the origin of the Samaritan woman story. The extreme hatred between the Jewish nation and the Samaritans. And it went on for generations after generations, the things that occurred. One of the sons of Joiada, son of Elisha, the high priest, was the son-in-law to Sanballat the Hornite. Now, Sanballat's area is to the north. It's up by Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal and Shechem. That's that area that we today just generally we say Samaria. We normally just refer to it as Samaria. Now, Nehemiah writes this. Whoever actually put the pen to paper, it might have been Nehemiah, because he wrote the books in first person. He says, and he said, and I drove him away from me. Now, remember, the law is you don't marry foreign women. And he'd already cleansed the temple one time before of all the priests who had married foreign exiles. Remember them, my God, because they defiled the priestly office and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. Now, he's the high priest, Elisha. And now he has in there someone who is in line. You'll find out in a little bit when I read just something from outside the Scriptures. He was next in line to be the high priest, this son they're talking about. And then again, he does the same thing Thus I purified them from everything foreign and appointed the duties of the priest and the Levites, each to his task, and I arranged for the supply of wood at the appointed time and for the first fruits offering. Remember me, God, for all the good things that I do. Same thing as earlier says, I hope God remembers how I kept the rules, how I did this. This is how Nehemiah, this person who served a very specific purpose. You have Zerubbabel, who had a calling, a purpose. Rebuild the altar, rebuild the temple. Ezra is sent back, reinstall the law of Moses. Teach the people about the law. Nehemiah comes back, and he is to develop the finishing of the city of Jerusalem and to enforce the covenant that they renewed, the original covenant. At the end, the questions that crossed my mind, how do you want to be remembered? Nehemiah is only concerned about one thing. Remember me for everything that I did in your service. It's a question that we all have to answer, isn't it? Every one of us have to answer that. Is that our mindset? Remember me, God, for the things that I did for you. Remember my faithfulness in keeping the covenant that we've signed. And we mentioned a couple of weeks ago how we had also signed a covenant. We've signed a covenant with God too when we became Christians. We basically were saying, we're going to do what you've asked us to do. You want to be remembered for the fact that you did what you said you were going to do. Now, I want to do some finalizing. We just have 13, 14 minutes. And I've taught this lesson a couple of different times at different places. And so I come up with some ideas that, one thing, first of all, when you read the Old Testament, when you read the events of the Old Testament, you have to understand that the people who were writing these things did not always write everything. There were some facts which they didn't think was pertinent to the story. For example, you say, one of the questions that always struck, well, how old was Sanballat in the time of Nehemiah? When Sanballat was in the story when Zerubbabel come by. Well, if you go to history, if you go to secular history, you will find that there were three. Sanballat was a family name. There was a Sanballat 1, Sanballat 2, and Sanballat 3. They all used the family name Sanballat. So here in the Scriptures, sometimes it talks about Sanballat when it was many years before. And here in the last, many years later, we have Sanballat showing up again. And in the end here, this Sanballat is the governor over Samaria. It's not the same Sanballat that was talked about when Zerubbabel came back. It was one of the kings or the governors in order. So when you look at, sometimes you have to go a little deeper to understand some things that don't exactly think. Remember when we were talking the difference between chapter 6 and chapter 7, I told you from one chapter where there's a period, and the first word in chapter 7, there was 58 years that's not recorded. That occurs in various places, sometimes in the Old Testament writings. There's gaps. It was not pertinent to the story. Nehemiah felt was important to be recorded in the history of the Jews. Now, it says, I want to do this right. Let me see. Well, maybe I'm not. Oh, here it is. One of the sons of Joiada, a son of Elisha, the high priest. Elisha, the high priest, his son was Joiada. His son was Jonathan. His son was Jadu. Jadu was the high priest at the time that the Nehemiah discovered that one of his sons had married Sanballat's daughter. In other words, all of the kings that occurred are not listed. But if you're the son, you're the son. My great-great-great-grandfather was Alexander Collins. I'm his son. My dad was his son. My grandpa was his son. So in Scripture, sometimes it can say the son of, and might skip a generation. So you may have a time gap in there that's not talked about. It is important for you to know that the high priest, eventually down his chain of people who took over the high priesthood, was the son of this one high priest. That's important because that shows the lineage, the Jewish lineage. Just like, did you know that David was the father of Jesus? Jesus was his son. Isn't that the way it's referred to in Scripture? So you have to think all those people that were in between were not pertinent to what the author was trying to tell you at the time. Now, one of the sons of Joiada is the high priest. He's the son of Elisha. But we know that there's there's two priests in between. And it says he drove that son. It doesn't tell you who the son is. It doesn't tell you who that person was. You have to go to secular history and you find out that the name of that man was Manasseh. But you got to go to secular history to find out the name of that son-in-law. And Sanballat, the third's son-in-law, was named Manasseh. And they were talking about having a joint high priest between Joiada and Manasseh, and having Manasseh serve as his assistant with almost equal authority. Now, I'm going to read you the secular history where some of this is told. We've got just about enough time. This is verse 28. One of the sons of Joiada, son of Elisha, the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Hornite, who was the governor of Samaria, designated by Darius. Darius is the king, the Persian king. He says, and I drove him away from me. This is the writing of Nehemiah. Now I'm going to read you what Josephus, a Roman, he's Jewish, comes from a very famous family of Jews who lived in Rome, who is a historian. They commanded, it says, this is what Josephus says, they commanded I'll get you right. Manasseh, to divorce his wife or not to approach the altar. The high priest himself joined with the people in their indignation against his brother and driving him away from the altar. In some of the writings of Josephus, he said the elders all got together and the people around the high priesthood, and they had quite an argument because of some of the things that they were allowing Manasseh to do with Jehu, the high priest. And they said, wait a minute, he can't be helping and be in line to be the next high priest if he's married to Sanballat's son-in-law. That's a foreign wife. And they all agreed. When Nehemiah writes the verse, Nehemiah says, and I drove. Along with the elders and all the other people, they all agreed, along with Jehu, the high priest, they drove him away. We have removed your linkage to the royal family in line to be the next high priest. So they did. They drove him away. Whereupon Manasseh came to his father-in-law, Sanballat, and told him that although he loved his daughter, Nicaso, Josephus tells you what her name was, yet he was not willing to be deprived of his sacerdotal duty on her account, which was the principal dignity in that nation and always continued in the same family. He says, I really do love my wife, your daughter, but I'm not willing to give up my position to be next in line to be the high priest for the sake of her. And then Sanballat promised him not only to preserve to him the honor of his priesthood, but to procure for him the power and dignity of a high priest, and would make him governor of all the places to himself that he now ruled, if he would keep his daughter for his wife. He also told him further that he would build him a temple like that one at Jerusalem upon Mount Gerizim, which is the highest of all the mountains that are in Samaria, and he promised that he would do this with the approbation of Darius the king. With permission of Darius the king, which Sanballat is the governor of Samaria, he said, the king made me, and I'll get the king to agree. Manasseh was elevated with these promises and stayed with Sanballat upon the supposal that he would gain a high priesthood and bestowed on him by Darius. For it happened Sanballat was then in years. Sanballat III was an old man. But there was now a great disturbance among the people of Jerusalem because many of those priests and Levites were entangled in such matches, for they all revolted to Manasseh, and Sanballat afforded them money and divided among them land in Samaria. So Manasseh was not the only one in the priestly group that had done that. And the elders not only said, Manasseh, you're out of here. You give up the wife or you're gone. But they told the others the same thing. You have to give up your wives or you're gone. So this thing goes deeper than just one person. Now we know from the story of the Samaritan woman, when she talks to Jesus, she said, our fathers worshipped on this mountain. You guys, you Jews from down in Jerusalem, say we have to go to Jerusalem to worship. And that's when Jesus has his conversation with the woman there at the well. So that's a reality, but the hatred that existed between those Samaritans. So it wasn't just Manasseh that went, but a lot of the Levites. And I think I told you earlier that today there's over 700 of those people who yearly come and make a march up the side of the hill on Mount Gerizim to do a worship service. Those are the descendants of those Levites who went with Manasseh in the Samaria. There's around 700 of them They dress up. They have their robes, just like the ones in Jerusalem. They carry the big scroll with them, and they go up and they have a worship. They are still doing that today. Okay, so there's history lived out in Scripture hundreds of years later. Probably 2,500 years later, that history is still being lived out by something. Now, we would have lost that if we did not have the historical record of who the person was and the people that went with him. It bears out the scripture that Nehemiah wrote. He said, and I drove him away. And he might have been the guy that got the command, just like if the elders here decide on something, they said, this is the way that it has to be done. The elders at the temple said, listen, we're completely uneasy about this fact that Manasseh is married to Sanballat's daughter, and he is helping Jehu, the high priest, in some of the duties, and he's in line to be the next high priest. And we've already signed a covenant a few years ago that said we're not going to do that. We're going to dissolve those marriages, and they're not going to be in the priesthood. So it just proves out Nehemiah was absolutely correct. That's what happened. They drove him away from the temple. In the last 2 seconds, this is the time of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great is presently attacking Tyre. He was there for 6 or 7 months defeating the people of Tyre, and he goes from there down to Gaza. That takes him 1 month. And then he comes to Jerusalem, and he's fixing to enter into the city of Jerusalem. Jehu knows what's going to happen. If Alexander the Great comes against Jerusalem, he'll destroy Jerusalem in nothing flat. He goes out to meet Alexander the Great outside the city, all dressed in his purple robe, and all the priests are all dressed in their white linen robes, and they go out and meet Alexander and show him where Daniel, in his prophecies, stated that a Greek would be the one who defeated the Persians and drove the Persians out. And Alexander the Great says, I had that dream when I was a young man of meeting you coming out of Jerusalem. God is not only playing his game right there. God is playing his game in Alexander the Great with a dream that he would be the one who would march in and destroy all the Persians. Thank you very much.